Thyself is dedicated to the exploration of the most rewarding task an individual can ever embark on, the journey to find oneself. Our intention is to investigate the universal principles that have equipped our species to seek the treasure of all treasures, self-knowledge. With your hosts, Daniel and Eduardo, this is the Know Thyself podcast. Recording.
Great.
Well, let's do this, man.
Game on.
Welcome to the Know Thyself podcast. I'm here with Daniel.
Hello.
I'm Eduardo. And let's do this. Our continuation of last episode with the second labor of Hercules moving into the astrological correspondence with Taurus. So today's episode will be a continuation of last week's episode on the second labor of Hercules, which we sort of left off on a very interesting conversation, which had to do with desire. And Daniel already spoke about how we will do a whole episode dedicated to desire, right? But today, with continuing this conversation, we'll go a little deeper into, there's so much to cover here with the astrological correspondence to Taurus, but also the second labor and how Alice Bailey does a wonderful job of bringing in so much detail as the second labor does also. One thing I know that I really wanted to talk about with you today, Daniel, is the second house. Obviously, the continuation of this idea of desire through this lens with Taurus, and also the 4 3-letter words that are mentioned in this, which is God, sex, law, and sin. And so, again, it's a lot to unfold, but if you listen to last week's episode on the second labor, this will be that continuation of an unfolding conversation that we might have throughout, even in season 3. So exciting stuff. I'm excited. I'm kind of all over the place. This is like my second time recording the intro because it's a lot, like right before you showed up, I was like, don't read too much into this. Just keep your questions that you already had from last week in your mind. Don't create new ones. But then I see you, man, and I know you were out of town, and then you're back. I'm like, oh, all these new things come up. So pardon me on the long-winded intro, but let's get started, dude.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And great intro, man. And this is an exciting topic because we're approaching this esoteric understanding of form and just how important form is in our self-discovery, and it's the construct of the experience of our soul, and it's one of the most overlooked subjects in spirituality. A lot of times when we approach spirituality, form is really seen as this, kind of like this Maya illusion. But again, that was something that was kind of lost in translation from the East to the West. And when there was this kind of huge, almost like pilgrimage of Eastern information that was kind of coming to the Western mindscape, right around the turn of the 20th century in the 1900s, there was stuff that got, lost in translation. And I think we kind of attach this idea that all form is bad and the material is the devil. But form can kind of trap us, but within form is also the key for our illumination and kind of our escape and this higher understanding. And so this conversation about form, its esoteric significance, is going to be something that we obviously have been speaking about in this podcast, the entire life of this podcast, and in the future we'll kind of continue this. But what this is saying is this is represented by this astrological energy. And everything we speak about on this podcast can be brought back to one of these astrological signs. We had the birth of consciousness last week. Our first one with Aries. Mm-hmm. And now we're really seeing that consciousness finding a housing unit in form, right? And so, the big questions we're looking at is, do we see what form is trying to tell us? Do we see how it's trying to guide us? And that's what I think this story does such a great way of breaking down. And we're going to talk a little bit about desire, but something I'm really excited about in the third season is approaching the subject of esoteric psychology.
Yes.
And that we will really go into detail about desire and just how much desire plays a role in our life. And again, we kind of have this lower version of desire, I think, in in the West, and we don't really truly see the higher aspects that can come from desire. Same thing with like the subject of ego. A lot of people speak of ego like it's a completely negative thing. Lower ego is something like this carnal desire that we're kind of talking about with Taurus. Of course, it's something we want to champion over because we're trying to establish the higher ego. And that's the same kind of thing with desire. Desire is not good or bad. It depends on how you use it in this free will experience.
Yeah, how you express yourself or what you're wanting to express with the energy that's driving you there. Because like I know they mention it as thought impulse, and I agree. I think that's something that in season 3 I can't wait to jump into, is that there are these negative connotations to the word ego or to desire that we'll definitely talk about when we do an episode on desire and what it really means for us as humans to have a true understanding of what the desire is intended for, not rather than the way it's been told for us to be. To sort of have an understanding of it, which again is from a lower perspective that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Or a lower understanding, rather.
Yeah. And again, everything comes down to free will. How do you use the tool? A hammer could be a very damaging thing, but it also can hang the most beautiful piece of art. And so I'm excited to kind of continue this conversation of the esoteric significance of Taurus.
Right.
And so like you said, we're going to cover those 4 3-letter words that Alice Bailey felt was so important to kind of attach to this sign. We're going to even talk about a little bit more of like the exoteric information about Taurus, like you would kind of more see in an astrological book. But really importantly, how I'm excited about like ending this show is we're really going to talk about the second house. And what's going to be nice about this is when you're approaching esoteric astrology, it's the study of the soul and the evolution of the soul. And really what astrology is like the birthing of your authentic self, and the process that you go through that to unfold that manifestation. But the nice thing about studying the houses is we get a little bit more of a personal approach with this. Some of these ideas we're going to kind of talk about are going to be a little bit more closer to like astrotheology and like really big picture. And what's the nice thing about the housing systems is it brings it closer to home because it's a house. And so we're going to be able to more experience this and see how this works through us, because you're so right. This Aries energy was that thought impulse. Well, thought impulse is always going to be followed by sensation and desire. And it's something we have to understand. And it's something that we really have to incorporate into ourselves. And again, it's not slaying the bull is what we're supposed to do. It's taming the bull. And that's kind of what this process is going to be looking at. And that's really what Taurus is going to kind of allude to us. And so, it's this interesting kind of energy as we, approach this idea of form. And I'm excited to kind of jump in with it with you.
Well, I think everything that you're saying right now really relates to something that I took from when Alice Bailey has this quote in the meaning of the labor at the end. So if you don't mind what I'll say about it really quick, that I think it kind of goes right with everything you're saying to kind of lead us into that, is, when she talks about this energy of Taurus and the right understanding of the law of attraction, I like how she says how the law governs the magnetic force, and that the principle of coherence, which builds the forms, which we talked about form, through which God or the soul manifests. And I feel like that's a brilliant way of her putting it into such, I love how she puts these things into such simple words, because that's sort of what we kind of do a long-winded explanation on when we're talking about this deeper understanding that you're sort of alluding to. And so I just love that that was your own thought that you just had prior to me interrupting with this quote. And I had to pull that quote in because I'm like, look, you're saying the same here to having this understanding of like where this is going to go and what we're going to talk about in the second house,
Absolutely. And really, truly learning. And I'm glad you brought up that quote, because we really do need to understand truly what the law of attraction is. It's bigger than the manifestation of material things. It is the aspect of what attracted your soul to this very body that's listening to this vibration coming through your ears, and it's a process we've gone through since we were a single-celled organism. The law of attraction is what pulled us down into the realm of matter. And it's the thought impulse of the creator, and it's how we create. And it's because we come from the creator, we have this impulse and this ability to create. And that's what we're really going to see in this idea of understanding how to use this magnetizing force and this harmonizing force. And what we're really supposed to do with that. And we spoke about that last week with the, utilizing this energy for the unfoldment of the self. But truly what we're trying to do is to find that authentic self. And I really am excited about ending this conversation as we approach the second house, because you're really going to see that that's what the zodiac is. The zodiac is not trying to make you like this one other person. This zodiac is trying to make you. That authenticness is truly what the study of astrology is really based on. And when we kind of can start to see that and start to see the beauty in our own form and see the beauty in our own individuality, then this Taurus is actually, then we've hit the bullseye. You know what I mean? Now we're on pass. And we're going to kind of talk about what kind of pushes us and all this kind of energy. But, I do like how she kind of was speaking about this idea of, the second labor really being in this desire world and the potency of desire, right? And we were kind of talking about like you said, the law of attraction and how it's this magnetic force that's so important. But should we jump into those 4 words that she thought was so important to connect to this labor and to this sign?
Sure, man. I mean, she has this whole stretch, through, if again, we said this last time, if you haven't read The 12 Labors of Hercules by Alice Bailey, highly recommended. And that's where we're going off of right now between this conversation. But towards the end of her summary, she has these 4 symbolic words, right? And again, that's God, sex, law, and sin. And yeah, do you want to just start with God?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's start with the big one.
Simply,
Yeah. Let's just jump into that.
The sum total, right, of all. So
yeah, and again, we could speak, forever on this subject and only scratch the surface of this. But this is actually a very powerful word, and this is also something that I think gets almost like sometimes criminalized, and spiritual people actually don't. They have like a knee-jerk reaction to this word. But this word, the reason why they have a knee-jerk reaction is probably because of manipulation, because this word is actually very, very powerful. And the interesting thing about God, and what she kind of speaks about it when she defined it, was the sum total of all forms, the sum total of all states of consciousness, and the energizer of life. A lot to cover there, right? Kind of a big subject.
Right.
Interesting thing about this word God, we actually don't know truly the etymology of this word. We actually don't know where it came from. We have some connections to Norse mythology, because like if you think about it, in the original Hebrew Bible, they don't use the word God. It was Elohim and Yahweh. So this wasn't in the Hebrew language. And we think that it might have come from like Nordic mythology. It could have come from, we know it kind of came from like Proto-Indo, like that language kind of family there, but it's very hazy, and so truly where they actually believe that this word came from is from African origin. And African spirituality is not only the most lost spirituality because they were so unfortunately like ransacked and their history was completely destroyed, but it's some of the most potent energy comes from Africa with spirituality. And you can just see this, why there's such that's still the gem of the world for all these power countries who go and they just steal all the resources. Well, they stole all the spiritual information from there as well. And so there's a connection to Africa with this. If you're ever reading about something in spirituality and it goes back to Africa, you're on the right path. That's some deep, deep information. Everybody needs to study. Even if you don't have any African descent in you, it's what we all came from. We all need to get connected to that mythology. And again, it's probably the most esoteric and hidden. Apart with that, with like the Druids and some of these old other organizations who didn't really write things down, or their information was kind of taken from. And so again, we don't know the etymology of this word, but we know Gud, which was in the Nordic mythology, what that broke down to was, the giver of life, life cycles, milk, semen, sound, breath, food. Anything that transferred life was kind of connected to this aspect of God. And God is an interesting word because you can also break it down as an acronym. And so we have G-O-D, and we have generator for the G, operator for the O, and destroyer for the D. Well, you just kind of covered everything right there.
Right.
You have the creation, the operator, and the destroyer. And so this is a really, really powerful word to connect with and to even meditate on. And again, if you're not comfortable using that word, you can use whatever word you want, but we've I think it's almost had like a bad rap because of, again, esoteric, maybe Christianity in the last, couple hundred years, I think did a way of kind of like hijacking that word and taking the true significance from it. But if we can think about it in the way of generator, operator, destroyer, well, now you have, you've condensed all of mythology into a 3-letter word, and there's something really powerful about a 3-letter word. It's like almost a representation of the Trinity itself. There's a reason why she chose 4 3-letter words for this, and that's not by mistake. And so this energy is everything. And it's something that we really need to just meditate and maybe, change our relationship with that word, because there's a lot of power in it. And just the vibration in itself, it does interesting things to water and to plants just by that vibration, and again, you think about it, there's not a lot of words that almost like sound like that in like our language. Like it stands out when you hear it, and so there's this distinct vibration that kind of comes with it, and there's a lot of power. But truly what we're looking at here is the sum total of all experiences in all form. And so us just kind of going through this aspect of consciousness, we are experiencing this God energy, us just experiencing this form, and how we energize life is going to be the same way. And so anything that carries life is going to be this connection with this God energy. And that covers so many subjects.
Again, I'm sitting here listening, and Daniel looks at me like, is there something you'd like to say? And I've told him before, sometimes I'm just like waiting to finish a thought as you're still, speaking. But absolutely, man. I mean, I think, when I was reading the second labor, I told you this before we decided to do the first or the episode prior to this, where I just thought it was I didn't expect there to be this breakdown of these 4 3-letter words that were going to be brought up, but much more, I didn't think she was going to she being Alice Bailey, she was going to have this way of expressing the idea of God in the way that you're talking about. And I think it's imperative that, we kind of go back to the idea of why we're even talking about this story, and she does a great job at sort of roping you back into saying like, hey, before we even go into these astrological connections that we're all going to be such fans of, and now that we have an understanding of what they actually correspond to, let's go ahead and, keep the idea of what these words actually mean in our, not only society, but in our world. And so, yeah, I don't know if that kind of ties into what you're saying here, but, when she talks about not just God and the sum total of all its forms, but the sum total of all states of consciousness, and how it's the energizer of life. I think you kind of just sort of sum that up beautifully for exactly what it needs to be understood, that we don't take the word as serious as we should, and meditating on it is very important. You know what I mean? Because I think that it's easy to sort of say something like, I believe in God because he's in you and he's in me. But come on, I mean, there's so much more to break down on what we're saying about that. You say that to a child and they might agree with you right away. They're like, oh yeah, I know what you're saying. I feel him. If you feel him, or feel God itself. And it kind of just ends there. There's an agreement there, but certain people are just like, no, I just don't really have that connection that you're talking about. And I don't know why you feel so clear to say it like that. So I think it's great that she does that in this pretty quickly, just kind of, again, using the idea of all state of consciousness and the energizer of life is pretty great how she does that. So,
and one of the things we spoke about last week was that law of signatures, and how this God energy leaves its signature in all things, all aspects of form and all aspects of consciousness, and this was to remind us that it never forgot about us, even though we forgot about it in this aspect of kind of falling into this polarity differentiation, this self body, right? We lost connection to that oneness we were a part of. And that's what we're making the journey back to. But this understanding that because all aspects of form come from God and all aspects of consciousness come from God, we can actually see this signature in every experience. And so, we spoke about it with an episode really early on with hide and seek. And we were talking about, hide and seek is that game of finding God in everything and seeking God in everything. And when you can do that, this is how we're actually going to overdo these desires, because this is what we're going to kind of connect with of what is the true desire that I should be pushing out here? What should this energy be doing? And if we can see even the lower forms of it as this inhibiting of this signature making itself present, all of a sudden we're more empowered to kind of make this approach and make these big changes in our life and kind of overcoming some of this more Mayan illusion of this, of the kind of cultures and societies that we find ourselves in. And so it's an interesting thing. I actually had a great story of somebody who sent me a message, a friend of the podcast, Mitch and Cassidy. And Cassidy works at a hospital, and she has one of our little Know Thyself little punk rock pins that we made. Mm-hmm. If I'm ever in your town and you want stickers or pins, I probably have a backpack full. And so if we're ever in the same place, let me know. I will make it rain stickers and pins for you. But she was wearing it, and one of her patients just looked at it and saw the sun and was just like, God. And it was just so powerful. She sent me a message, and it just changed my day, because it really was this beautiful kind of energy. But that was the exact feeling I had when I first saw that sun, because that's such an old expression. And you see it in esoteric art, and you see it when, all these amazing artists on Instagram who, we share their film, their art, and they share it with us. But you see it in all aspects, you see it in everything. You see it in your relationships. You see it in, the physical form. And that's also something that we're looking at, is just understanding that is the causality of everything, mm-hmm. is this true beauty of this God energy, and then also understanding that this God energy is not only the generator, not only the operator, but also the destroyer. And that's something we're going to really approach today when we get to the second house, is that idea that, within form, everything's going to be destroyed. Right. And how do we find balance in that? How do we find security knowing that this is a finite experience? And so, it's a beautiful subject. And again, we're going to approach this topic, and it's been the main topic. It's the elephant in the room that's been the topic this entire podcast, because it's truly what we're always talking about. When you're talking about the esoteric, you're talking about this God signature and finding it in these things. And, and we even talk about that with the breaking down of movies and, the breaking down of art. Everything can kind of come down to this true lowest common denominator. And there's a great quote from a scientist around the 1900s, and he said, the first sip of science, you taste atheism, but when you get to the bottom of the cup, God's waiting for you. And I think that that's that was a perfect connection with me, because once I started kind of, becoming more of a materialist when I was 12, 13 years old, and I really kind of was getting dominated by that left side of my brain. I truly was. I thought I knew everything. And I was kind of this stark atheist, and then it wasn't until I actually started to get to that bottom of the cup, and I was just sipping the surface, that I was just oh, there's something bigger happening here, and there's a bigger connection here. And so it's just kind of this beautiful thing, because we're always, every day as we're making this approach, we're getting closer to that bottom of the cup. And we always see that it's always been waiting for us, because it never forgot about us, and I think that's a beautiful thing to kind of keep close to our heart as we're on this path. And we go with these ups and downs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that what I wanted to go back to from what you said earlier is the acronym of the word God. It has the same parallel journey to the way we operate in our existence. And so you have generator, and then you have the operator. And I think that those two phases in life, in our journey, in our path in the physical form, dominate our ability to reach total understanding of ourselves and consciousness, because in the end, which is ultimate destruction, you find, a hesitancy. And so I think that, I know that right now in our culture, in the Western world, that is, we're trying to open up new doors to the idea of death and dying. Other countries have already accepted death as part of this existence, that is just as beautiful as a birth. And I know for us in the Western world, or for some, there are more and more alternatives now to reaching that state of consciousness, but some people don't even need any kind of substance or some sort of guru to get them there. You should just know that on your own. When you see God or feel God on your own path, you also know the full circle of how it's going to, end. And even the word ending is something that maybe we can sort of remove from the idea of what it means to walk on this plane in the physical form. And so I really like that way of putting a generator, an operator, and then destruction, because I really think that most of us are just in the state of operating. But, when you operate under that influence of that light consciousness of God, you also have a agreement with it has an expiration date and it's okay. And so I think that's a beautiful thing that encompasses this whole idea of what we do on the podcast. Because I think a lot of people obviously have reached out to us with a lot of positive feedback, but there's also people who think, what are these guys talking about? Like these two friends, and what they're saying is incorrect. Sometimes maybe they feel that they disagree with our dispositions, but that's not like the whole idea of what makes the podcast. The podcast is us just giving you examples of literature and personal experiences of how this energy works through us, and what the expiration date is, and how we don't own any of it. Like you and I both don't even sit here going like, we own this information. This is us here. It's just something that we can all just sort of express and relate to all at the same time. And I think that's when you get to see sort of that evidence of like that higher consciousness working itself out without us having to do much, because people are like, hey, I feel what you're saying. And I feel like these stories, just like the Labors of Hercules, are doing the same thing, where it's like, this is how I'm kind of trying to connect you and energize you through this information that you already should know deep at the bottom of that cup you're talking about. But it just takes some time to get there. You know what I mean? I said this once before, but I'll say it again. I only find more spiritual door or more openings to spirituality in my darkest hour, always, because that's when I really go seeking for it. You know what I mean? I can't make it up. It just sort of finds me, and I find it at the same time. And then in the end, you just sort of feel like you just, went up a notch and you start all over again. So anyways, kind of went off on a tangent.
No, I loved it. I loved it. And, you kind of think about like the acronym of God, and we bring up that D aspect. And I love how you brought up how the West is trying to get a more sound relationship with what death is and what the destroying energy is. But, destroying old patterns, negative thought habits that we're in, negative emotional responses, negative, not having a positive relationship with an experience, that destroyer energy is so important for our spiritual growth. If you don't use that destroyer energy, you're just go. You're just generating and operating. And we're in that go society, and we don't look at aspects of what do we need to destroy? What do we need to stop? And that's going to be something that really kind of comes up with the countersign to Taurus, which will be Scorpio. And we'll talk about that, why Scorpio is the sign of death, and like why Scorpio kids were the kids on the playground that were like, did you know you're going to die? And you're like, why would you, me as a Cancer rising, I'm like, why would you say that? I want to call my mom. But like, it's so important, and like you look at the countries, the civilizations that were connected to the serpent cults, these ancient cults like Mexico, they have like one of the healthiest relationships with death. Right. And they celebrate it and they honor it and they see it as like this beautiful thing. And we can see that again. We talked about how much serpent wisdom is in Latin America and how it's still intact to this day, even in the flag of Mexico. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge, we can see the generator, we can see the operator, but really what we need to understand is that destroyer aspect. And that's the hardest part of this connection with God, is the idea that like, everything's like the game of Monopoly. It doesn't matter if you had Boardwalk, it doesn't matter if you got the little top hat piece and you went around the board and you had all the money. Everything goes back in the box at the end of the game. And that's the ultimate lesson of that game. And that's the ultimate lesson of this life. And, what are we carrying back into that box? And so, yeah, I love that aspect of, just bringing some attention to that D that comes at the end of that word and why it's so important.
I think that, again, back to whether you have ultimate understanding of yourself, or even when we talked about the Fool, it's just because you think you have it all figured out during the time you generate and then operate, it doesn't really have any, this is also finite. And I feel like that's the final piece that sort of gives you, again, the physical idea of making a full circle. Mm-hmm. It's like, from where you came from to where you go back to. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, we deny it a lot. And then in this labor, he talks about desire. And again, we will talk about desire in the sense of psychological approach to that lower vibration of the idea of desire. But here, again, she talks about God in all its forms. And I think that it's imperative to know that even though it is the energizer of life, it also is the taker. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And and how important this is for us to, destroy relationships to things. It's important for us to, as we're raising a child, to go from that aspect of, this isn't an infant anymore. This is a toddler. I have to destroy that aspect that's an infant. I don't have to coddle it as much. This isn't a toddler. This is a teenager. I have to destroy this aspect of babying this, and even when the child becomes an adult, you have to kind of destroy that relationship. And that's what creates long lasting relationships, because everything is this phoenix, this rebirth. We always need to be born through the frames of this kind of destruction. And you think about what creates a long-term relationship with even a partner. And we're going to kind of get in this with this next word with sex, but how important that is to, that initial fire of attraction is going to burn off. So you need to destroy that initial attraction. It needs to get something creates deeper, and you need to kind of destroy what brought you together and recreate something bigger. And this is how you make lifelong friendships. This is how you make lifelong relationships. We had a lot of individuals that we used to skate with and play music with that we're not as connected with today. And it's not so much like we're that guy's a turd basket or something, but it's more like me and you evolved together. And as our relationship had to form from being in the punk band Clinton's Pet Donkey to forming to us traveling the world together, to us doing all these kind of unique projects to where we find ourselves today. It went through that process. We had a lot of death and rebirth in our relationship, but that's how you make everlasting life. And that's how you actually go back in that generator operator role.
Totally.
Right?
Well, I was going to say, we've always, as friends, have operated from the bottom of that cup that you're talking about, that you're sipping from. And I think that's what kind of makes this relationship so unique, is that we're not operating from the surface. We're not going, okay, where will this lead us and how much could we gain from this or that? Or, let's just experience it for the physical form of for the sake of a physical experience, I should say. We're always no, the meaning behind it was this deep, and then the rest just kind of blossom from there. And I think that if more people can find themselves with other individuals, and again, let's move into now the second of the four. When you move into finding a partner, whether it's again a friend, a mutual friend, or an opposite sex, or even the same sex, but having the intention for what the understanding of desire is first, and then what you're going to do with that partner, where are you operating from? Where is it coming from? What's the real intention? So yeah, you're right. We don't have a lot of the same friends we used to, but then I go back, I'm oh, but most of the stuff that made us a common denominator was that we basically just were operating on superficial things. And then when you try to have a conversation that goes deeper than just those things that made you friends, you kind of find yourselves at different levels or different stages of your life. Mm-hmm. But anyways, that being said, moving on to, finding that partner and with the idea of sex, that desire attraction that is mentioned,
right.
Or she puts the instinctive urge to creation, the pull of the soul, The urge to divinity.
Yeah.
I like that.
Absolutely. And again, this word sex is, we have such a false understanding of what sex is, because we only think of like physical sex between two individuals. But, this is just life in operation. This is the aspect of a positive and a negative pole coming together. So again, when we fell down into matter, to be able to perceive this experience, we had to go through that differentiation stage, and we had to get polarized, right? That oneness had to be broken up into two, and that's what gives us polarity, right? And so what sex is talking about is it's just the interplay of the positive and the negative. Like right now, we are having sex. I'm speaking, so I'm protruding energy at you, and you are receiving it. You're the negative energy. So right now I'm talking through this like masculine component because I'm pushing the energy out, and you're receiving this energy. So it's this positive negative flow that's kind of happening. Okay. And again, when we say masculine and feminine, we are not talking about biological gender. We are talking about the positive component of the universe and the negative, the aspect of protruding force and receiving force. And it's something that we have to have a beautiful connection with both of those. And again, when people are like, oh, I don't like how the feminine is considered like this negative force. Well, just go into a little bit in spirituality, and you see that there's so much more strength in surrendering than dominating. It's almost easier to dominate. When you truly surrender, that's like the bravest thing you can do, especially when you surrender to the right things like natural law. And so this is life in operation. This is happening at all moments. It's the positive and that negative force that's interplaying. And this is, it's the interplay between the objective and the subjective. She speaks about that. It's the attracting of the spirit to matter, that positive force to that negative housing unit. One of the things that we spoke about when we were talking about squaring the circle in that alchemical and the many houses of God episode, we talked about how we are all actually females, because we're all receiving that positive spirit energy from this creator God force. Mm-hmm. And so we're all actually God's women. And so we, not all of us can have a womb and carry a baby, but we're all receiving energy on that mode. And, this is also the interplay between the exoteric and the esoteric. And with sex, we have desire and attraction. And I like how you brought up that instinctive urge for creation. And that's going to play a really big role, because that's going to really tell us how we master this aspect of sex and desire, because we really have a carnal approach to it in our society. This is why, the pornography adult industry is such a dominant industry, and this is also why that's an industry that's free, because you are the product, and they're taking this really sacred energy from you. And they're pushing it through the lowest form possible, so you have the lowest relationship with it, so you won't find that divinity within yourself, and especially through like intercourse, And again, this is important, and I'm glad that you brought this up too, because in the intercourse of physical sex, there's always somebody who's giving the energy, and there's somebody that's receiving that. And it's the same thing with a homosexual relationship, right? There's somebody who's giving the energy, and there's somebody that's receiving it. So this has no connection to what your sexual preference is. You're all experiencing this. We're all sometimes female in the relationship, and we're all sometimes males in the relationship, because we're both of those. And that's something that we really have to break through with this polluting of this esoteric thought form that's happened in our culture. And it's not by accident that they did this. They're trying to obfuscate the law of gender to make you confused. Because these components, they all live within us. We have this feminine component in us, and I have this masculine component in us. And it's always this aspect, like, I'm giving you a gift at a holiday. That's a masculine thing. I'm giving that gift, and you're receiving it, and then you give it back. Now all of a sudden you're the man, and I'm the female in this energy. And we speak about this with how important this is, because, and how powerful this feminine force is of this surrendering energy, and what really comes from that. And that kind of gives us some of these deeper lessons. And so again, sometimes people, again, I love all the messages you send, but sometimes individuals are like, I know what you mean when you say masculine and feminine, but I have like this knee-jerk reaction. But that's on you. This is esoteric information that's been here since the beginning of time. Your knee-jerk reaction is because of false indoctrination that's happened from social engineers who are trying to confuse you. And so we have to kind of separate that kind of stuff.
Well, one thing that I think is, to add to that I actually took away from, Alice Bailey that I really like is in the idea that the attraction between the parts is all within the whole. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter, what you're attracted to or who. It's that second component of the positive and the negative that come into one and making that whole exist, mm-hmm. And I feel like don't take these ideas to the point where you think, well, I don't agree with what they're saying. We're not trying to get you to agree. We're just trying to give you the deeper meaning of what that whole actually mm-hmm. is and how it's created, which is why I don't feel uncomfortable when Dalen says, as we have this conversation, there's a portion of me that is protruding my energy and you are receiving, because it's exactly what we do, mm-hmm. And you do it even if you don't recognize you do it. You know what I mean? I know for a fact, if I ever received a gift from you, there's two things that happen at once. I have to channel in the aspect of my mother of kind of having my voice go up and say, thank you. And I have to sort of put my guard down, which is something that I have in a male sense to feel vulnerable for a minute as you've given me a gift. So these energies that we're describing as masculine or feminine are working through us at all times, mm-hmm. However you're receiving or giving that energy. Mm-hmm. So again, to take it beyond that and think, oh, they're talking about this something I don't agree with because I don't identify with is not really the path that we're trying to put down with this conversation. Right. So I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. And we're not saying either that the patriarchy hasn't been oppressive, and we're not saying that the sacred feminine is something right. that has completely hijacked. We honor the feminine mysteries here because that's what the mystery schools are. Like the information we're talking about in the esoteric is the feminine. It's the keeper of all the knowledge. There's something so honorable about that. And I think that's so beautiful, but it's just one of those things. If humans weren't here in this postmodern idea that's totally where our thought process is totally controlled by media, in corporations, not even humans, but corporations. If we weren't here, Romeo, your dog right now, would not be arguing about this aspect of gender. Nature doesn't get offended by this because it's a law of nature. It's like it's like gravity. It's just part of it. Now, we all know that we're in that oneness and what's what we're trying to make it back to, but nature wouldn't be having this argument if it wasn't for us here having this. And again, we have to realize that just like with causality and cause and effect, polarity, they use it against us with the voting of the red and the blue, and it's just oh, this is my party and I just blindly part of this party, and everybody has to choose sides, and this is part of the process that they've been doing forever to kind of keep the barn animals fighting each other so they don't realize that there's actually no fence and we're free and we can be liberated from right. this, And so again, it's something we have to kind of look at. And, one thing what we spoke about on this too, and it's just anytime it kind of comes up with the esoteric and spirituality, that God force energy we talk about doesn't mind what you do in your bedroom in the private of yourself. As long as it's two consenting individuals and they're of an age of an adult, none of this aspect of age is just a number. That's postmodern kind of bullshit that they're selling us to really do something there. And so, as long as it's a consenting adult, that's whatever you do, that's with you, as long as you're not impeding, you're not dominating somebody out of their control, that's fine. That the whole idea of homosexuality being punished, that was exoteric Christianity. That was power control. And it was so sad what happened to those people. And it's so nice that we're liberating from that. We're really approaching this age of Aquarius, but it's just something we have to approach because I know a lot of people message us about it and they kind of get upset. And so,
well, yeah, we understand. It's funny because I know that we're kind of coming off a little bit on a tangent here, but I think everything you're saying is great to cover because, as a full disclosure, it's our opinions aren't the one and only way that you should, view life. And I've had this conversation with a person, again, a side note, because we are talking about this idea of sex. And prior to that, we bring up the idea of God and how it is the sum of all these forms. But I remember I spoke to this individual a long time ago, and we were talking about pornography. And all I said before he got very defensive was how I don't agree with an image that is placed into my subconscious, then I act on as it sort of fills in the schemas in my brain, the file cabinets that we have. That kind of just sort of made me think about what you're saying about the idea of this conversation that we're having and how listeners have that knee-jerk reaction. But it's like, hey, rise above the fact that this industry can create these images and give them to you for free. Like, think about that just for a second. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, I'm condemning you for it.
Right.
And I'm not saying, get what I'm saying?
No, yeah. And again, too, I don't want to. We do kind of go on tangents, and we had late coffee today, so we're all jazzed up.
But I like what you're saying. I mean, she is talking about sex, and then we are talking about that law of attraction. You did talk about causality, and all those things are part of that conversation we just had. Not to defend our conversation, but I'm just saying, like, that's kind of where it's going, where it's like, okay, like, just pay attention to what what you're giving out with that protruding energy and why you're putting that protruding energy out there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's all about Taurus rising above what the physical expression is, and again, too, we know, like, one of the big things we're going to kind of talk about is, the damages that happened with the patriarchy in the age of Pisces and how we lost so much deep information, in that kind of evolution away from that. And so that's something we're totally aware of. And we just want you to know that we're not talking about like that physical gender here, and those. And again, it's just one of those things that you kind of have to understand, because it's one of these 7 hermetic laws, and they're going to try to, because this is the foundation of this consciousness experience, they're going to try to pull you away from this. Obfuscation is one of their biggest tools. How can they muddle up the waters so you don't see your clear reflection? Well, this is how they do it, and they're going to kind of do it through this process of the media, which is so funny because media comes from media, which is the Greek god of illusion, and like, it's just so funny how we just play into it. And, it's just an interesting thing. And again, it's this aspect of, we need to know ourselves, and we really need to understand what is really kind of happening here with this.
Do we move into what's next? Are you finished with sex?
Well,
I don't want to jump in. I just wanted to ask you that genuinely, because I like how you were just kind of like alluding to like
natural law.
Yeah, of laws.
Absolutely. And no, and I think we can kind of make it, but again, this goes beyond just that physical intercourse. And one of the things that I think is so important too is, one of the things that we really need to learn too is there's like this middle path here with sex, because sex could be used as like, like you look at like some like sex magic, and that's really like this idea of like, oh, the physical orgasm is the highest and the closest you can get to consciousness. And that's not really the case. Like, yeah, that's an experience that can happen. But there's almost a responsibility to do there. It's not just a physical sensation. There's something that can actually happen there when you're deeply connected. And you kind of spoke about it with like sexual alchemy, like we talk about with like the Karma Sutra, and like really when you kind of educate yourself on it. But also on the other far end of it, of like being celibate. We see the same damagings with that. We see the same person who's addicted to sex and is almost like a sexaholic, as you see like the damaging that happens with celibacy. And, because we have this urge and this desire for creation in our life, celibacy isn't for everybody. Like, the only way you could truly kind of be in like the celibate aspect is if you are creating on the mental and the physical in an amazing way, like almost like Nikola Tesla. Like, you need to be operating at a very, very high rate to kind of be able to work through that, because that energy kind of builds up. And again, there's like beautiful practices of like retention that people do that's like really powerful, but you have to find an output for that energy. You can't just like stop it and think everything's going to be okay, because you're just going to be building up this natural life force that's within us. And so you have to find other expressions. And so that's something to kind of investigate. But if you are trying to get a little bit more of control on that and more ride the bull, again, it's not slaying the bull, and it's kind of like learning how that energy goes. But we'll approach that with esoteric psychology and this aspect of desire. But it's this interesting thing that there's really a middle path on, just like everything, and kind of learning what that is, and not going too far into this idea of just sensation, and then not also going to this other side of like completely shutting that down, because it's energy that needs to be expressed, and so you have to put it out in a creative force some way. It could be like crazy, amazing artist sometimes can do that, but they're producing art at an amazing rate, and that's like all their focus. So they're still creating something. So you have to substitute some other sort of creation for maybe not just like the human creation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier with desire and ego being something that we're going to, talk about in the third season. But we said this before with ego, is that you don't want to kill your dragon. That's not the goal. The goal is to tame it and use the energy for when it's necessary, and not necessarily let it dominate you either, but not dominate to the point where you have made it obsolete to where, now you don't have that generating force that you might need from the ego.
Yeah. And, and it's so funny because this sex energy, when we're talking about more of this like energy of creation, that's what gets the bull moving, because the bull is like kind of the lazier sign, right? And we kind of spoke about that. But even like bull riding, and I don't know if they still do it, but they used to like shock the testicles of the bull to get it to start bumping, because like if not, they would open the gate and the bull would just chill with this like guy on top of him. He's like, what do you want me to do? Yeah. So that's how you get the bull moving. And so
they do that, or they just tie them.
Yeah. Or they tie them, And so this is what we kind of see of like how you use creation to kind of help direct your desire, and that's why we kind of want to put it to the highest form of creation. We want to make sure that we're kind of going through this highest aspect of desire. And I don't know if we spoke about this last week, but this is also what like the Spanish bull, the running of the bulls is about.
You did. Yeah.
We did speak
just
about
like
that.
Letting it all out, but also not getting trampled by it.
Exactly. And like how like, you can live in that desire, sensation energy for a long time, but then one day that bull's going to catch you, and it's going to, it's not going to be fun for you. And so again, so much interesting energy. And one of the other things I want to bring up with this aspect of these components is this Taurus is the most feminine of the signs because it's form. But isn't it funny that the Taurus is a bull and a bull's a male cow? And then we thought about Aries, right? And we have it as that ram, and it's like that very protruding force. But then you look at the sigil, and it looks like the female reproductive organ. Yeah. So do we see how even this duality is contained within it? And it's not talking about the physical gender. This is talking about the esoteric aspect of polarity, and why we need to see that positive and negative force. And if we can learn that, we could really almost start generating our own kind of battery power and really kind of start raising that kundalini and really like raising that force within ourselves. And so, Eduardo, I'm so sorry if my little tangent gets us canceled. But hopefully let's cross our fingers that it doesn't.
I think we'll be just fine, man.
Either way, we'll just go to the underground. But so yeah, let's move to the third, which is law.
Yes. Yep. And law is my favorite that she brings up in all this, because even when I was a child, I would try to, and shout out to my mom, right? Veronica, I know you're out there. But she would entertain these kind of conversations, and she still does with me. And I'm like, my mom must think I'm insane. But here's something that Alice Bailey says about law. The thought-impelled response of God to form. The habits instituted by the timeless interplay between the polar opposites, which have been recognized by humanity as the inevitable law of nature. End quote. So, and not that I was saying that as a child, but what I was saying is that it's like, I get why there is this. I get why there is this sort of boundary here, or why there's this understanding amongst all us beings to not cross this line. But what is that? And why are we all in agreement with it? Not the ones that are obvious, like say if you take, in my case, the 10 Commandments, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Why would you do that to someone? Et cetera, et cetera. But then you realize that we have impulses and we do cross those lines. And so I always thought, okay, how does this law, how does it come into our conscious state of mind, and how does it go all the way into our soul to where we all in our agreement that this is not what you do? And of course, there's moral guidances that we follow, and we talked about this with principles from the Hermetic principles in the series that we did in the first season, and how that governs us. But I think the way she puts it, beautifully with the thought impelled response of God to form is great. So let's go there, man.
Yeah, no, and I love that you brought that up. And again, interesting thing you brought up Moses, because when we talk about astrotheology, Moses is really the representation of the prophet that moved us from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries. Because remember, when he comes down the hill with the 10 commandments, his followers are worshiping the golden calf, and he gets up scared and he breaks the 10 commandments. And if you look at Moses's staff, it's the Aries ram. And that's what he represented. It was that moving away from the materialism to more of this like birth of consciousness, which was going to be this new beginning. And so again, we think about law, and I think a lot of time we think about like the material manifestation of man's law,
right?
And how different that is from natural law. And that's what we're really talking about here. We're talking about law with the capital L.
Yes. Not
the law that's like, oh, in this place you can drink this thing, but if you cross that imaginary line, you're punished, and it's like, how does that work? Like, isn't this all like the earth? Like, why would that make sense that you could do something here and you couldn't do something there? And so, we have this like limited understanding, I think, of what law is. And again,
totally,
they've obfuscated law, like with even like how language works and how, even when like you talk to an individual about studying law, all they're telling you is like, oh, you just have to learn a new language. You actually have to learn like maritime terms, and like you really kind of start to see like how we're actually kind of controlled this. But even man's law was kind of based off of natural law. But natural law is that immutable force. It's what we have to surrender to. There is no, you surrender to it and you can kind of command it, but it's more you just learn how to direct and flow with its energies, but there's really not like this aspect of commanding in this way that I think is almost like sold in some of like the magical community, because it's more of a surrendering and understanding that path and what kind of comes with that. But, we think about these natural laws as like cause and effect, the law of polarity, the law of vibration, all of these things we spoke about. But they're immutable. And this is something that we have to learn to understand, to observe, and then learn how we kind of align with that. And that's the difference between pain and growth. When we move away from natural laws, we feel pain. When we align ourselves with natural laws, we feel growth and we have self-exploration. And so it's a really, really important topic to kind of think about. And just the study of natural law on its own is something that we should all kind of look into. And the beautiful thing is how we learned about natural law is through form. And this is what that when we talk about how this can be, our own prison or the key to illumination, and it's learning the laws that Mother Nature is presenting to us, of creation working through her as that housing unit. And nature is the greatest way to kind of learn these laws. And you see animals operate on this, you see nature operates on this. Like nature, like we don't even think about the aspect of like nature rest, in the winter. Why don't we, but we just continue the 9-to-5 work week and like do everything like it is. Some cultures are a little bit better of giving like vacation. We know in America, it's just like, it's your 9-to-5. And like, if you're not pushing 8-to-7, you're not really like in with the company, and you're not driven enough.
I think it's interesting that everyone kind of has the same agreement. Even meetings are like, well, maybe in the next year,
right?
Because this quarter, I don't know, we're all feeling a little, it's like,
well, I mean, just look at like a drive-through coffee line. Like you go through any drive-through coffee place, like even on the way here, that line is like 12 cars deep at all times of the day. It's like, and this is why energy drinks are such a big thing. Like this is why so much stuff is a big thing. And I think this is also why like alcohol and stuff, like people going out because they don't have the time to rest, but they need to escape a little bit and like get that kind of connection. And again, everybody, you have your own relationship to all these things. Like I'm sipping on a coffee right now. And I'm sure tonight when I'm like trying to go to bed, I'm like, I probably shouldn't have had that afternoon coffee, right? That was a little abnormal for me. But
I have no regrets.
Yeah, but and again, it's all trial and error of humanity to this recognition of this natural law, right. And that plays this really important opponent. And if we really see this natural law as like that objective force, and natural law is truth, and we're not the arbitrators of truth. We don't create truth. It's aligning our perception to truth, which is spiritual development. Your perception is not reality, and that's something that you'll hear people say, perception is reality, and that's false. It's aligning your perception to reality. that's what the spiritual process is. And nature, again, the universe is always leaving its signatures. It's always leaving its lessons. It just depends if we see them. And if we don't, it sends us into the same patterns. And we were like, oh, why did that relationship fall apart? Why did my insecurities come out again? Or, why did I lose that job? Or like, why am I out of money again? It's like the same pattern until we start to see it and be like, oh, it's because I'm in this negative cycle and there's things I need to recognize. But, it's part of the process. Like, que sera, it's what we're doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that trial and error of kind of connecting to it. But at one point you go, and that natural law is kind of like that high priestess card. And it's always been waiting in that chair. And it's just like, oh, you done burning in the fires of your own hell or drowning in the waters? And it's just like, yeah, and then we kind of start that process,
No, yeah, I know you talked about a little bit about the interplay between the polar opposites. She mentions that here with law. But yeah, we having no ability at times, or giving our ability of recognizing that interplay, we don't have the ability, not recognizing where those are within natural law, is part of this rising consciousness that we're talking about here. So, the imposition of the will of God and the empress of that will upon form and its recognition by man. What do they mean by that? That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, and that's what it is. Natural law is the will of God.
There you go.
It's what it's trying to do, and this is what it's put into place so we would evolve. Because remember, consciousness is operating through us, and it needs us to evolve. And we decide on how long this process goes for when we start to accept it. Because universally, we're all going to, consciousness is going to make itself back to that wholeness, but we actually kind of almost decide that timeline. And this is a really deep esoteric information, and it's a great thing to kind of think about. But everybody talks about World War III and the big what are we going to do for that powers to be, and how there's kind of manipulation that kind of happens. But one of the things that we need to understand is that the war in heaven has already been won. That was won when God said, let there be light. Light overcame this darkness of this lower self. So the war in heaven has already been won. The battle in the heavens between good and evil and consciousness and dark and consciousness and the lack of consciousness, not darkness, but the lack of consciousness already prevailed. It's only when we accept it. It's only when we actually come to terms with it as humanity that's already been won. That's when this process is going to happen. But there doesn't need to be a physical conflict. It's already been done.
Exactly.
And universe is going to allow the individuals that are kind of manipulating to stay as long until we figure that out. And they know this, that they can only stay as long as in power until we figure that out. But it's already been won. This was the eons ago. It's just when we come to this realization and when we actually make this kind of connection. And so that's what natural law is letting us know, is that consciousness has already prevailed. When are you going to accept that? When are you going to accept it within yourself? And that's what natural law is always doing. And it's natural law, punishes the immature individual, just like gravity punishes us if we don't understand it, right?
Absolutely, man. I think this is, again, you're setting them all up perfectly, but this is where I get excited to go right into what I would identify as part of sin.
Perfect. Yeah.
Because that's the sin we create with ourselves, is not believing that war has been won, and that light within us is just, it's a switch that needs to be flipped. And I'm making it sound, I understand, very, easy and very, not just easy, but easy to obtain. But it really is. It's in you. You just have to turn that switch on, And so I think that part of my definition for sin would be in conjunction with that idea of just not turning that on and doing yourself a disservice for not actually, aiming towards what you want to actually,
right.
Or what you should be aiming towards,
Right. Missing the mark, right? Not hitting that bullseye, which is kind of what Taurus kind of wants to help us do. And you're right. It's the uprising of the individual unit against the whole. But we're not talking about the individual unit as the sovereign self. We're talking the individual unit as that persona related lower self, because it's when we actually connect to our higher sovereign self that we can actually become a part of the whole and actually evolve in this evolution of consciousness. Because the whole is the evolution of consciousness.
Right.
And, you evolve consciousness by fulfilling your destiny. That's what the universe is holding. That's what the angels hold their breath for, is that you fulfill your destiny. And you're like, well, what is my destiny? Well, what do you like to do and what are you good at? I bet that's a good indication of like why you were here. So many people are like, oh, like this is what I love to do, but this is what I find myself doing. And I just feel lost, and it's just like, well, look at that stuff. That stuff's so important. Even when we do the natal charts, people are like, I want to know like what my chart says about like the career I like. And I could tell you like what you're looking for, whether you're like nurturing, whether you want to like help the future. But we don't even have to look at your natal chart. A lot of times I'm like, well, what do you like to do? And people are like, oh, like I would love to work with children. And it's like, well, bingo. I think that's it. You're like, and the thing is people are like, well, then everybody's going to want to just be an artist. It's like, not the case. You have people that want to paint. You have people who want to, you have people who like to do finances and manage people's monies. Like that's a responsible thing. And there's something really great about helping people manage their money. Like everything needs its component. And if we really see that we're all we're all individual workers in this great plan, and we need to just understand what we are supposed to do, finding that authentic self by going through the zodiac, well, that's what consciousness wants us to do. Like it's not making it so complicated for us to figure out like what our purpose is. But
Right.
You finding your purpose is like what, again, the angels hold their breath for. And when you find it, they dance and they sing, and it's like this beautiful thing that happens in the heavens, and you feel connected to these finer substances. And life is just this interesting thing that kind of unfolds that way. And so, we really kind of have to look at that with that idea of sin and that idea that, God, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what sin kind of does. It really kind of tries to separate everything up and, again, break everything up into its component, which is really important. But even when you break stuff up into its component, kind of like how Virgo likes to do, Virgo still needs to kind of go back and put it back into the whole. And that's like part of the process that Virgo does a really good job of. But we kind of need to separate stuff out, and we kind of need to break stuff up. It's part of the evolution of consciousness that we're finding ourselves in. Like when we're talking about the house system, like when the Egyptians were looking at the zodiac, they didn't break it up in the house system because they had more of a holistic lens back then. They didn't have to break stuff up into sections to be able to understand what that section represented. Well, we're going through this like process of forming into matter, and like the consciousness it's going through this evolution that we kind of do have to separate reality to kind of understand it. But that's actually what we're working back to at this point with this age of Aquarius that we're moving into, is like seeing all these little parts that we've separated consciousness and this experience of humanity as, and kind of connecting it with the larger network. And that's kind of what the evolution of consciousness is calling for us in this coming eon that's kind of approaching.
Oh, dude, that's awesome. To tie it all together, I think everything you just said kind of, pushes it towards, and I'm just so excited to read not only what Alice Bailey has to say, but uncover everything that she describes. Because, and again, we can continue talking about sin, but one thing I want to say that I love how I'm going to quote her again, but she says here, "Thus is the story of the universe written for us in these 4 words: God, the whole; sex, the attraction between the parts within that whole; law, the habit of the whole; and sin, the revolt of the unit in the whole." I think that's just so awesome that everything you're saying. Again, we didn't plan this out. That's why I'm all jazzed. That's why I get jazzed when I'm on the podcast with you, because again, Daniel and I aren't really, this isn't scripted. This isn't, we do have an idea of where we're going to go with this, but here, you express these ideas in a way that I hadn't really interpreted yet, or maybe had, and you sort of open up that idea even further that she lays down in this awesome, not only description of the story, but the meaning behind it. So, yeah, man.
Absolutely. No, and I love that. And again, we're going to kind of be breaking down this second labor of Alice Bailey throughout this podcast, because this idea of form and really kind of gaining that connection to it is so important. But what do you think? Do you want to? Should we kind of approach the second house of astrology? Do you want to cover that today?
Let's go. Let's do it because again, we're not done yet with Taurus. We're not done with we haven't even talked about the theme of elimination.
Yeah,
and that's a whole other thing that we'll bring up. But to kind of wrap this up, if you want to, I know we've already been talking for a while, and I don't mind keep going, but I do want to hear what you have to say about the second house, because again, we're on that second labor. We're talking about this Taurus energy. Might as well just sort of like tie it all together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm hoping too is because like the stuff we talked about today is like real big picture stuff. And I think people are like, well, how do I apply this to my life? We can understand like, sexual energy and stuff like that, and creating like a healthy response to that. But it was very much abstract. And so maybe the nice thing about the housing systems is, again, it makes this information more homey for us and it makes us feel more connected to it. And again, this is so fascinating because when we talk about the house systems, it's so important for us because we went through this process. And so we started the conversation with the house systems as that first house, and we spoke about that as like the ascendant and the rising. And we talked about its connection to Aries as it's like this birth of consciousness. And that moment when we took our first breath in this reality, in this realm, we turned online and we were kind of connected and forever married to that sign that was on that rising sign. It was on the eastern horizon when we took our first breath. And we just talked about that first house as not only the lens that we see life through, but also kind of what we feed back in from. But it was this explosion of consciousness. It was that individual spark of the individual identity. And we learned about, a little bit about our approach and our feedback of life. And so if you're curious about where that would be for you, is you would look up like your first house, what rules your first house and what sign is there, is going to give you an understanding of kind of that energy of not only the lens you view life through, but what you actually feed back into. And again, if there's planets there, you're going to want to include that in your understanding. A Cancer rising with a Mars in the first house is going to be different than a Cancer rising with Venus in the first house, right? We're kind of learning about that. And a good way for you to kind of understand that is like look at the astrological sign, kind of study the planets, and you'll see some unique kind of connections. And so if this first house is the individual spark of identity, now what we're going to kind of do is forming more of this solid sense of the I and the self. And
right.
So, what we kind of see here is
like the self-worth.
Kind of self-worth, and that's what's going to kind of come up here, but more of just like this connection with the body.
Okay.
Because we come online in this reality, but we're kind of just like this jello meatball for the first 6 months, right? We don't really have control of our body. We're not really falling into form yet. And so this is what we're doing. We're creating the housing unit for this consciousness to be held in. And as a baby, you're not really in it until these like first 6 months. And we kind of spoke about that as like the wiggling of our fingers,
right?
In that moment we wiggled our fingers and realized that we were our own separate entity from our mother. And there was this whole process of starting to kind of see what was me and what is not me, because we kind of move away from this aspect of the mother being everything and being like our security blanket. Well, now we look at our feet and our toes and we're like, well, these are my toes. These are not my mom's toes. Those are her toes. We had to do this same thing with our hands. Like, well, these are my hands, not her hands, right? And what we're going to kind of approach here is as we're kind of differentiating ourself from the not self, and this is a really, really big step in the realization of, that we are separate from our mother, and the mother was the whole world to us at this point. Like, we actually have to realize that the mother is not us. And again, that's a part of something even bigger because it's not only just the mother, but it's that universal mother that we actually got separated from. Like we see our mother as the physical representation, but what we're kind of processively consciousing is not only we saw our mother as an extension of us, but we were an extension of the universe at this time. And again, we're falling into our own. We're going through this stage of differentiation. And so, before that, we didn't see that difference. And we only saw, what we thought was everything. And like now we're looking at stuff and like, well, this belongs to me. And this doesn't belong to anybody else. So we kind of learn in the second house of like who we are. And and what we possess. And so with this discovery of the body as this separate awakening, we also have this realization of our finiteness. Because what happens is we get a little bit more curious and we're like, well, hey, like this, I'm going to wiggle my hands, I'm going to move my toes. What else is not me in my environment? And we kind of go to move, but we're still not in that form to be able to move, and we fall and we hit our head. And we have our first experience of self-inflicted pain. And so we have this realization in the second house is like, although there's a fire inside of me that I can't put the beginning on. And we talked about that as like our spiritual ego, right? How it's kind of like, there's no beginning and no end. This spacesuit that I'm in, this is finite. And I have a feeling there's an expiration date here. And so this second house is so interesting because what this is it really gives us this idea that, how do I find security in this 5-sense reality jungle where everything is either eating or getting eaten? Everything's bigger than us, and we're fragile and finite. How do we find security in this existence through this? And this is what we're going to kind of look at, because what we're going to see is we're really going to kind of start to discover like what we value and what is important to us.
Yeah.
And this is, again, why this second house is so important to pull in all the topics we were talking about with Taurus, because we can't have our security in physical things. We have to have the proper relationship to our physical things. We have to have the proper relationship to our relationships.
Exactly.
How do we find security in this finite? Because it's the elephant in the room. Like, we don't speak about it very often, but we all gonna die. You know what I mean? And like, we have to accept that. And how do you accept that? Not living in fear, not getting bitter, not being like Captain Hook in Peter Pan, right? Where he's so afraid of the crocodile, which is the Ouroboros, right? And the Father Time, which is the clock. And he becomes a tyrant. And he starts, dominating people because he knows that natural law is going to dominate him at the end and take his form from him. And so how do we find security in this world? And so this is a really important thing, because without security, you're not really going to be able to blossom into your authentic self.
Right. That blossom meant by self-worth, not to interrupt, but it's like you have your period in time where you acquire materialistic possession that gives you worth or gives you security, but then you must evolve from that into what made you acquire that into self, and then that gives you self-worth. That's the real value, is understanding like, no, I was worthy of all the things that I obtained. The things that I obtained weren't my worth.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And again, there's no like material things are something that we acquire in life and what like connects with you, but it's when we put our identity and everything in it, that's when it can kind of get destructive. And again, your fancy car is going to break down, even these walls that are covering us right now are going to turn to dust at one point. Everything goes back into the box, into this physical realm. And so this second house really does, you see it as, in most astrology books, they'll talk about like money, possessions, and maybe some like skill sets. What's that?
That would be like a sun energy involving that.
Well, no, yeah, but it's again, you want to get down to the deeper aspects. What is money? Money's a form of security.
Right.
What's a possession? It's a form of security.
I'm saying for those who read that and they think, oh, this is what the second house represents, is like just money. But yeah, I'm in agreeing with what you're saying. Is like, it's deeper than that.
It's deeper. Yeah, absolutely. Just like you can read about the first house sometimes and people are like, oh, it's how you approach situations. And you're like, way deeper than that. Yeah. Second house, way deeper than just what the tax man's worried about, which is like your possessions, and it will give you your values, which is really important, but your values are what kind of create your security. And, and this is a really tough thing for us to kind of connect to, because, how do we handle things like death? And again, I'm not saying like, oh, with death, you should just be numb and not go through the experience. But like, even in death, we have to understand like, well, do I really like believe in, or do I really truly understand this aspect that energy doesn't die? And so just because the form that I was in, like I loved with, and that was such an important thing with my life, do I truly understand what it is I do? Like, we get tested when our security comes around. And it's something that we're going to have to come to face with those experiences. When I lost that, my friend Drew, who is really the the CEO of this podcast, because I know he's what brought us together to do this. You know what
absolutely.
I mean? Absolutely.
That's how you and I reconnected, and we should tell the story on Drew. But one thing that I wanted to connect Drew to the same thing I'm about to say is that what I said earlier is that if you have that self-worth, that is what's going to give you ultimately, in my opinion, the peace you need to let go of the physical form that you've acquired. The physical form was only there for you to be able to express that inner God that we talked about earlier, the God that is in all of us, and put it out into the physical world and leave it here with the energy that you've created, but not take it with you. And it's okay to let go and leave it here. Mm-hmm. You did your part. And I think that's how I felt about Drew when I met him. I'm like, oh, the end goal for all of us shouldn't be so much, again, the worth of my possessions, but the self-worth that I've always had that allowed me to acquire those possessions. And he already had made peace with that. But I don't know if did you want to mention Drew a little bit?
No, I think we could cover that. And I think one of the things we've never done is we've never really given any kind of background about like who we are and how we got into this information. And I know a lot of people are kind of curious about that. So I think we'll have an episode.
Yeah. And it's hard too. It's easier between you and I talking. It's funny you said that because you just like brought up to the forefront for me. I did a video on Patreon and like I started kind of going down that rabbit hole and I pulled back because I feel like we'll save it for another time where we can talk about this because when you and I reconnected, there was what had happened with Drew hadn't even like occurred yet. It was just one of those moments where I'm like, oh, you found yourself a very interesting friend that I'm like in awe of. And I remember that's how it all began, but you're absolutely right. We should, in the next season, what we're planning on is a lot. And one of those things should be having that conversation of what led us to even get to this point.
Right.
And how we even like entertain each other to have these conversations. That's another thing. It's like, it's not that I never knew I could have these conversations with you. It's that you allowed them to be held. And I was like, oh, he's just being nice. Like he's just letting me talk out of my butt like I am right now. And then he's just like, yeah, my friend Eddie, and then I'll see you later. But no, little by little, you were more and more astute to be like, hey man, there's a book you should check out that kind of talks about the essence of what you're bringing up to this conversation. So I can't wait to have that conversation with you about how we got to this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm totally excited, man. And yeah, man, I think it's a good way that summarized, I think it was kind of a paraphrase of a Jungian quote, but with the second house, we only discover what supports us when everything else we thought supported us doesn't support us anymore. And we do have to go through that aspect, because like we do lose that aspect of like, oh, I'm an extension for my mother. How am I going to protect myself? How am I going to survive in this 5 sense reality jungle that we find ourselves in, being, these thin-skinned, walking on 2 legs, almost always in the process of falling down individuals,
right.
And we're in this maze without any instruction. So how do we find security? And so, certain signs find security through different things. And so that's another reason why you kind of want to explore your own natal chart and see where you find security and just how important that finding that true security is, because we're going to get tested with a lot of difficult things. And this is why you really need to move this information from knowledge to wisdom. And it's not just something that's connected in your mind, but it's actually something that you've instilled into yourself and you've kind of incorporated this into you, because that's what this esoteric information more is. It's not just fun facts or bar trivia. It's for the creation of your character and the development of your heart.
I got to say, we keep defending the podcast in this episode and the last couple episodes. And I think it's interesting how it goes with the fact that season 2 is ending. And I think it's great, man. I think it's awesome that, I know Daniel right now isn't defending the podcast because he feels like there's something that we haven't said about ourselves and why we're here. But I think it's important to continuously reiterate the fact that this information isn't new to anyone. And we're just using ourselves as a conduit to just sort of give you information from our perspective of the greater universe and all its mysteries that it tries to kind of aid us in. It's not necessarily like go on this intense journey and excavate to the deepest depths of what knowledge really means. It's like, no, what is leading you to something to be discovered, in my opinion, is the universe itself, and it's God working through. This is my opinion again. God working through you to get there. It's like, no, here's the sign. I'm giving you the sign. You're just not looking over here. And I just think that, we keep saying this on these final episodes that are just, again, this information, as much as it's fun to talk about and go on and on about with us two friends, really is just, again, the aiding of another component to rising to the next octave or in this journey to higher consciousness, besides just the spiritual jargon that's out there, or, whatever people think that this might mean through a podcast. And so, that being said, though, thank you to all our Patreon members.
Yeah, absolutely.
You guys are amazing. And all the fans and all the listeners, all the haters, everybody who is included, because it's all your energy that you're sort of mixing in together as a community with opinions that need to be talked about and need to be expressed. And Daniel said this last time, we are working on a forum right now, and we're going to be moving to season 3 and give ourselves more space to have this real expression of where we're coming from and how we're going to put this all together, bringing in individuals onto the Know Thyself platform that are going to help us, get to that point. So thanks for your patience and your true, thankfulness back to us every time that you send us these awesome messages. Because that's my favorite. It's just people are just like, hey, I found myself in this place in my life, and you guys, just by having a conversation, I'm like, great, just have another person on this journey with us. Like, you're just as important as anybody else. So thank you so much for reaching out.
Yeah. The greatest honor in the world. Yeah. And, I think I loved what you kind of said to kind of finish this up. And it kind of goes back to this, one of my favorite quotes is like, what you are looking for is what is looking. And how important that is for us to really understand that it's all within us, and it's kind of this inward exploration that we kind of need to go on. And so, yeah, I love that you gave a shout out to everybody, and just, we're just so honored to be on this journey with each and every one of you. And we're so excited to see what this project that we had no idea what it was going to be is kind of unfolding. And did we even are we at 100 episodes? Did we pass 100
We're
episodes?
Almost to 100. We're not there yet.
Okay.
Which, again, we've just been going like crazy. But this expression that we both have or this need to express this information, I always theorize this, that the most complicated thing in the universe tries to find its way to us to have an understanding, but ultimately reach peace within. Yet we convoluted the entire idea by using this interesting method of complicating it with words that are beyond our understanding to give it a place in space. And I think that's so interesting, because it takes people away from a given right of ours in our soul to have this understanding of what we speak of. But yet, to get to it, we have to use things like the 12 Labors of Hercules or so many other stories, allegories, whatever, just to express this beauty that is always within us and around us. And so, yeah, it's just the nature of who we are as humans, I think, is to overcomplicate an idea that can't be understood. If it can't be understood, then it must have some kind of quantum background, and maybe having an idea of physics will help you reach sort of these new levels and tiers of this understanding and vibration. But ultimately, even a child knows what's really going on within their heart, on what guides them to stand up and wiggle those toes, or to have, a connection with their mother without even having the words. And I feel like we're just having to find ways to go back to that with less words in order to have that expression of what that means. You know what I mean? Sorry, I kind of went out there.
No, I love it. I love it.
Cool, man. Well, yes, we are approaching the end of this season, and we still have to continue our journey on with the Taurus and these 12 Labors of Hercules. So it's going to just jump into the 3rd season, so that we'll make an announcement. I still think we should make an episode to wrap the 2nd season, though, like we did.
Oh, and our solar return when our first, we should totally do that again. Yeah. That was fun. We drank some wine.
And then, we'll continue on with this path. And, May's just around the corner, and that'll be our approach to the 3rd season and to the 3rd year doing this, man, which is
wild.
I know.
That's cool.
So, until next time then.
Until next time.
All right.